Part 1. They destroyed a human colony. Then 700,000 Earth warships arrived for total retribution. The morning on Aurelia Station was like any other morning. The sky inside the biodomes was a soft blue, the kind that the colony engineers had programmed to match the sky of Earth. Children were walking to school in small groups, laughing and pushing each other the way children do. Cargo ships were lined up at the docking bay, waiting their turn to unload food supplies and building materials. Everything was calm. Everything felt safe. Dr. Priya Sutton was already out in the outer biodome before most people had eaten breakfast. She was a plant scientist, and she spent her mornings checking on the new hybrid crops that the colony had been growing. She walked slowly between the rows of plants, writing notes on her small tablet. She liked this time of day. The dome was quiet, the air was warm, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant noise of the waking colony. Far away, aboard a patrol cruiser near the edge of the system, Commander Cole Hargrove was sitting in his quarters reading a message from his younger sister, Mara. She lived on Aurelia Station with her husband and 2 small children. In the message, she was talking about the harvest festival that the colony was planning for the following month. She wanted Cole to request leave so he could come. She described the food stalls and the lights they were going to hang along the main avenue. Her voice was warm and full of excitement. Cole smiled and set the message aside, planning to reply after his shift. Back on the station, Sergeant Darius Owens was 3 kilometers above the surface in a small repair shuttle. There had been a problem with one of the outer relay antennas the day before, and Darius had been sent up to fix it. He was not a technician by training, but he had learned to handle basic repairs over his years of service. He was working quietly, his magnetic boots locked to the outside hull of the shuttle, when he looked down at the colony below him. It looked peaceful from up there. Small and bright against the dark rock of the planet. Nobody saw the Veth ships coming. They came out of faster-than-light travel directly above the colony, appearing from nothing like a wound opening in space. There were dozens of them, large and dark, their hulls shaped like nothing human hands had ever built. There was no warning broadcast. No demand. No signal of any kind. The Veth fleet simply arrived and, less than 10 seconds later, opened fire. The first shots hit the colony's defense grid. The defense system was designed to handle pirates and small raiders, not a full military strike force. It lasted less than 3 minutes. The automated guns fired back as long as they could, and then they were gone, turned to twisted metal and fire. After that, there was nothing standing between the Veth guns and the colony below. Priya heard the first explosion as a low, deep vibration in the ground. She looked up and saw a column of black smoke rising from the direction of the port district. For a moment she thought a ship had crashed during docking. Then the second explosion came, and the third, and the sound was no longer something she could explain away. She dropped her tablet and ran. There was an emergency bunker at the edge of the outer biodome, a reinforced shelter meant for pressure failures and accidents. She ran toward it as fast as she could, and she did not look back. Darius Owens, high above the surface in his repair shuttle, watched the whole thing begin. He could not move fast enough to change anything. He could only watch as the bombardment started. The first impacts were on the port and the defense towers. Then the Veth guns began to sweep across the residential zones. He saw flashes of light below him, bright and terrible, followed by clouds of dust and debris rising into the thin atmosphere. He tried to raise the station on his radio. There was no answer. He tried the emergency channel. Static. Cole Hargrove was on the bridge of his cruiser when the distress signal reached them. The signal was broken and full of noise, but the location code was clear. Aurelia Station. He read the code twice. Then he told his communications officer to verify the signal and sat very still in his command chair while he waited. The verification came back in less than 30 seconds. The signal was real. He looked at the star map on the screen in front of him and calculated the travel time. Hours. It was hours away. Far too far. He stood up and walked to the far end of the bridge, where no one would see his face clearly. He stood there for a moment with his back to the crew. He thought about Mara's voice in that message, talking about the harvest festival, about the lights they were going to hang. Then he turned around and his face was calm and hard, the way a man looks when he has decided something without words. The Veth fleet was over Aurelia Station for 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, they destroyed the defense grid, the port, the power stations, and most of the residential zones. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they jumped back into faster-than-light travel and were gone. They left no message. They sent no broadcast. They offered no explanation. They simply came, destroyed, and left. When the firing stopped, Priya was in the bunker with 11 other people she had never met before. They sat in the dim emergency lighting and listened to the silence. Someone was crying softly in the corner. No one spoke for a long time. Priya sat with her hands flat on the floor of the bunker, feeling the cold metal, and tried to understand what had just happened. 2,100,000 people were dead. 200,000 survivors were scattered across the wreckage, hiding in bunkers, drifting in escape pods, trapped under collapsed structures. Distress signals were going out in every direction, bouncing from relay station to relay station across human space, carrying the news toward Earth. On his cruiser, Cole Hargrove sat alone in his quarters after giving his orders. His crew was already preparing the fastest course toward Aurelia. His officers were already sending reports up the chain of command. Everything that could be done was being done. He sat alone and did not move for a long time. Then he opened his communication system and sent a single message to Earth Command. It was short. It said only this: "Tell me what we are authorized to do." In the council halls on Earth, the first reports were arriving. People were reading them and reading them again, because the numbers did not seem real. Administrators and officers who had spent careers dealing with border skirmishes and trade disputes were sitting in front of screens showing casualty figures that belonged to a different kind of history. Director Elaine Voss read every report that came in. She did not speak during the first briefing. She simply listened, and at the end she asked one question. She asked whether the attack had been an accident or a mistake. The answer came back quickly. It had been neither. The Veth fleet had made no navigational error. There had been no miscommunication. The attack on Aurelia Station had been a deliberate military action, planned and executed with full intent. Elaine Voss nodded slowly when she heard that. Then she asked for a complete list of the dead to be prepared and sent to every member of the Earth Council before the formal emergency session. Every name. All 2,100,000 of them. She wanted every person in that room to understand exactly what had been done. Part 2. They destroyed a human colony. Then 700,000 Earth warships arrived for total retribution. The days after the attack on Aurelia Station were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Across human space, people went about their routines in a kind of daze. They went to work, they fed their children, they watched the news, but everything felt hollow, like the world had lost some weight it was supposed to have. The images from the colony played on every screen: the broken domes, the fields of debris, the rescue teams moving through ruins that were still warm from the bombardment. The Earth Council held its emergency session 3 days after the attack. The room was full, and it was silent in the way that rooms full of important people go silent when the news is too heavy for normal conversation. Director Elaine Voss arrived last. She carried nothing with her except a single printed document. She set it on the table in front of her seat without opening it and sat down. The debate went on for hours. Some council members spoke about proportional response, about the importance of not starting a wider war, about the need to open diplomatic channels with the Veth Dominion before making any decisions. Others talked about the legal framework for military action, about what steps were required before authorization could be given. The voices were measured and careful, the voices of people trained to be measured and careful. Elaine Voss did not speak during any of it. She sat and listened. When the debate finally slowed and the room looked toward her, she picked up the document she had brought and placed it flat on the table. She pushed it gently toward the center, where everyone could see it. It was the casualty manifest of Aurelia Station. Every name, printed in small type, page after page. 300 pages of names. She said nothing. She just let them look at it. The vote was unanimous. Full military authorization was granted. What followed was unlike anything human civilization had done in 200 years. The Earth Unified Defense Fleet, which in peacetime operated at roughly 30% of its full capacity, was placed on total war footing. Shipyards across the solar system that had been building cargo vessels and passenger ships received new orders overnight. The orders were simple: stop what you are doing and build warships. The same orders went to every major human colony with industrial capacity. Factories that made agricultural machines were converted. Mining platforms were reconfigured. The entire industrial weight of a civilization that had spent 2 centuries spreading itself across dozens of star systems was redirected, slowly at first and then with gathering speed, toward a single purpose. Lieutenant Nora Callahan was one of the people responsible for tracking it all. She sat in a logistics coordination center on the edge of the Kepler sector and watched the numbers come in every morning on her screens. Ships completed. Ships under construction. Ships scheduled. Crew assignments. Weapons loads. Fuel reserves. The numbers grew every day, and every day they were larger than she had expected. She started a personal log around this time, and in the first entry she wrote simply, "The counting of ships has begun." Nora had not always been a military officer. Before the war she had been a civilian analyst, working on supply chain optimization for the colonial trade network. She was good at seeing patterns in large numbers, at finding inefficiencies and fixing them. When the attack happened she had applied for active duty transfer the same week. The military had taken her because they needed people who understood logistics at scale, and there were very few who understood it as well as she did. She was given a rank and a post and thrown into the middle of one of the largest mobilizations in human history. She was not sure how she felt about any of it. She did her work and she did it well, but at night she lay awake in her bunk and thought about what the numbers on her screens actually meant. Every completed warship was a crew of human beings who might die. Every weapon loaded was a calculation about who was going to use it and against what. She had always been good at treating numbers as abstractions. She was finding it harder now. On the other side of the growing silence, in the territory of the Veth Dominion, High Marshal Vorexon was receiving reports from his intelligence analysts. The first reports were dismissed immediately. The figures were too large to be credible. No civilization mobilized at that speed. His analysts argued, politely but firmly, that the data was corrupted or exaggerated, likely produced by human information operations designed to intimidate. Vorexon agreed with this assessment and moved on to other business. Then the listening posts began to go dark. One at first, near the outer edge of human-claimed space. A technical failure, his team said. Then 2 more, within a week of each other, in positions closer to the boundary between Veth and human territory. Then 3 more after that. The listening posts were automated stations, hardened against radiation and debris, designed to operate for decades without maintenance. They did not simply fail. They went silent, one after another, as if something very large was moving through space and swallowing them as it passed. Vorexon looked at the map of silent listening posts and said nothing for a long time. Envoy Thessan was not a military man. He was a diplomat, and he had spent his career talking to people who disagreed with each other and finding words that brought them closer together. He had opposed the attack on Aurelia Station from the beginning, had argued against it in private councils, had written reports laying out the probable human response in careful detail. Nobody had listened to him. The decision had been made by the military, and the military had not considered his reports worth reading. Now he watched the silence growing on both sides and he felt something cold settling in his chest. He submitted a formal request to meet with High Marshal Vorexon. The request was denied. He submitted it again. Denied again. He began working through back channels, reaching out to neutral intermediaries, looking for any way to open a communication line to the human side before things went further. Sergeant Darius Owens had been brought back to Earth after the rescue ships reached Aurelia. He was processed through medical checks and given clean clothes and a room in a military transit facility. Officers came and asked him questions about the attack, and he answered all of them in precise detail. He described the Veth ships, the sequence of the bombardment, the sound the colony made when the third wave of shots hit the central residential zone. The officers wrote everything down without expression. Darius spoke without expression too. He had learned to do that in the weeks since the attack. Feeling things clearly was a luxury he could not afford yet. One morning an officer came and offered him re-enlistment. There was a ground forces unit being assembled, the officer explained. Veterans of Aurelia with direct experience of Veth military tactics were being prioritized for placement. Darius asked one question. Would he be in the first wave? The officer said yes. Darius signed the papers without reading them. Dr. Priya Sutton was in a different kind of room on Earth, working on a different kind of problem. She had been placed on a civilian advisory panel responsible for drafting communications to neutral alien powers, messages that would explain humanity's position without making potential allies feel threatened. She wrote and rewrote and wrote again. Every draft felt wrong. Too soft, or too angry, or too cold. One night she sent the final approved version to the director and included a personal note at the end of it. The note said she had tried to make the message sound measured, but she was not sure that measured was honest. There was nothing measured about what had happened to Aurelia Station. The director read the note and did not reply to it. But she kept it. The counting of ships went on. 50,000. Then 100,000. Then 300,000. Nora Callahan watched the number climb on her screen every morning and every night, and she stopped trying to sleep properly and simply worked. One evening she went to the observation deck of the Resolute Dawn, the flagship she had been assigned to, and looked out at the starfield. She could see fleet formations in the distance, running lights moving slowly across the dark. She counted them for a while. She could not count them all. She stayed at the window for a long time, and the stars behind the ships grew harder to see as more lights filled the space between them. Part 3. They destroyed a human colony. Then 700,000 Earth warships arrived for total retribution. 6 months after the attack on Aurelia Station, the fleet was ready. The assembly point was a stretch of deep space far beyond the edge of any inhabited system, chosen because it was large enough to hold what was coming and remote enough that no one outside of Earth's command structure would see it until Earth wanted them to. Ships began arriving weeks before the final date, coming in from every direction, from every human-controlled system, from shipyards that had been running around the clock since the night the emergency orders went out. Nora Callahan was already there when the main formations began arriving. She stood at the observation window of the Resolute Dawn and watched them come, and for the first time in months she found she had nothing useful to do with her hands. The logistics work was done. The counting was over. There was nothing left to organize or track. There was only the view. The ships came in their thousands, and then their tens of thousands, and then in numbers that stopped meaning anything specific and simply became a presence, a wall of moving metal that filled the dark in every direction the eye could reach. Warships of every class, long-range destroyers, heavy cruisers, carrier platforms, escort fighters in tight formation. The sensor arrays on the Resolute Dawn could not find the edge of the fleet in any direction. Nora pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the observation window and tried to understand what she was looking at. 700,000 warships. She wrote those 4 words in her log that night and then sat for a long time looking at them. They did not seem like enough words. Commander Cole Hargrove had barely slept in 3 days. The final stages of fleet assembly required constant attention, coordination between hundreds of subcommanders, last-minute equipment checks, crew rotation schedules, fuel logistics for a force so large that supplying it required its own dedicated chain of ships. He moved through it all with the flat, contained focus that had become his normal state since the attack. His staff had learned not to ask him how he was doing. They had learned to simply present information and wait for orders. On the morning the fleet reached full assembly, Cole stood on the bridge of the Resolute Dawn and looked at the status board. Every sector of the fleet was reporting green. Every ship accounted for. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the numbers. Then he asked his communications officer to open a fleet-wide broadcast channel. The officer did it without asking why. Cole did not give a speech. He had thought about what to say for weeks and had never written anything down, because every time he tried, the words came out wrong, too large, too formal, too much like a speech and not enough like the truth. Instead he opened a file he had been given by the Earth Council's Memorial Office 6 weeks after the attack. It was the complete casualty record of Aurelia Station. He began to read the names. Every name. In alphabetical order, in a quiet, steady voice, without commentary. It took hours. The fleet sat in silence for all of it. On 200,000 ships, crew members stopped what they were doing and listened. Some stood at attention. Some sat where they were. Some wept. Most simply listened, because there was nothing else to do that felt right. The names went on, an unbroken river of people who had woken up on an ordinary morning and had not survived it. Children's names came between the names of adults. Old names and young names, long names and short ones, names from every part of Earth and every colony humanity had ever built. When the last name was read, Cole closed the file. He said only 7 words into the open channel, "We go now to make certain this never happens again." Then he closed the broadcast. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, one by one and then all at once, 700,000 ships began to turn toward Veth space. Envoy Thessan had managed, through 3 weeks of careful back-channel work, to get a message into the communications queue of the Human Fleet Command. The message was simple. It said that the Veth Dominion was prepared to open immediate and unconditional talks. It said that responsible parties within the Dominion government were prepared to discuss accountability for the Aurelia attack. It said that Thessan himself was willing to come to any neutral location, at any time, to begin the process. He had gone over the head of every military superior he had to send it. He knew what that would cost him later. He sent it anyway. The message reached Cole Hargrove personally. He read it once, then read it again. He sat with it for a while. Then he dictated a reply to his communications officer. The reply was short. It said that the Veth Dominion had been given 6 months. In those 6 months they had sent no apology, offered no accountability, made no move toward the families of the dead, and released no statement of any kind. It said that 6 months was more than enough time to do any of those things, and that none of them had been done, and that the window for negotiations had closed. It said this plainly and without anger, the way a person states a fact. Then it was transmitted, and the fleet continued moving. High Marshal Vorexon received his clearest intelligence report on the size of the human fleet 4 days before it crossed into Veth-claimed space. His chief analyst brought the report personally and set it on the desk without speaking, which was unusual enough that Vorexon paid attention before he even looked at the paper. He read the figures. He looked up at his analyst. He asked for verification. The analyst told him it had already been verified 3 times by 3 independent teams. Vorexon looked back at the numbers. He had spent his career understanding military force as a matter of ratios and calculations. He had fought and won battles where he was outnumbered because he understood terrain and timing and the psychology of opponents. He had always been able to look at an enemy force and see its limits, its angles of vulnerability, the points where it could be broken. He looked at the numbers in front of him now and could not find any of those things. He sat in his command chamber alone for a long time after his analyst left, and he did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. The fleet crossed into Veth territory on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. There were automated border markers at the boundary, relay buoys that broadcast a standing territorial warning in 17 languages. The human fleet passed through them without slowing. The first buoy's warning broadcast cut off as the leading edge of the fleet swept past it. Then the second, and the third. One after another the markers went silent, not because they were destroyed but because their signals could no longer be heard through the sheer density of ships passing around and between them. Nora Callahan was on the bridge when they crossed the border. She watched the marker signals drop off her screen one at a time and thought about what it had felt like 6 months ago when she had been writing numbers in a log, counting ships in the dark. She thought about what she had written on the first night, the counting of ships has begun. She thought about how she had not known, when she wrote that, what the number would eventually be. Now she knew. And now the fleet was moving, and there was no number large enough to describe what was coming toward the Veth Dominion, and there was nothing to do but go forward into whatever came next. Part 4. They destroyed a human colony. Then 700,000 Earth warships arrived for total retribution. The Veth military fleet came out to meet them 3 days after the human ships crossed the border. 40,000 warships, moving in tight formation, the largest single military force the Veth Dominion had ever assembled in one place. By any measure that had ever applied to interstellar warfare, it was an overwhelming force. Planets had surrendered to far less. Wars had ended at the sight of far smaller fleets. Nora Callahan watched it appear on the sensor screens and felt nothing in particular. She had spent 6 months living inside numbers. 40,000 was a number. 700,000 was a larger number. She noted the positions, updated the tactical display, and sent the data to Commander Hargrove without comment. Cole Hargrove looked at the incoming Veth fleet on the main screen and made a series of quiet decisions. He designated a forward engagement corridor and assigned it to 300,000 ships. The remaining 400,000 held back in support formation. The mathematics were not complicated. He gave his orders in the same flat, contained voice he had been using for months, and his officers carried them out without hesitation. The battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted 40 minutes. The human fleet did not charge or overwhelm. It maneuvered, absorbed, and suffocated. Every Veth attack found itself met and neutralized before it could do meaningful damage. Every retreat route was quietly closed off by ships that had been positioned hours in advance. The Veth commanders were skilled, and they fought hard, and it made no difference at all. They were not facing a force that could be outmaneuvered. They were facing a wall. The Veth fleet commander broadcast a surrender signal with 11 of his 40,000 ships still combat capable. Cole accepted the surrender immediately. He ordered the surviving Veth ships escorted to a holding area in the outer system and placed under guard. He gave strict orders: no unnecessary force, no provocations, all Veth crew to be treated according to standard prisoner protocols. Then he turned back to the main screen and looked at what lay ahead. The Veth home system was 3 days' travel away. He gave the order to continue. On Veth Prime, the capital world, High Marshal Vorexon received the news of his fleet's defeat in stages, each report worse than the one before. He sat in his command chamber and listened to his remaining advisors describe the situation. When they were finished, they looked at him and waited. His options were clear and none of them were good. He could surrender fully and immediately, turning himself and his command staff over to whatever justice the humans intended. He could order a last defense using civilian infrastructure as a shield, placing his remaining military assets in the middle of populated cities to make any attack costly in innocent lives. Or he could order his remaining forces to make one final, suicidal charge, knowing it would fail, knowing it would simply add more names to the dead on both sides. He was not a good man in every sense of the word. He had made a decision that had killed 2 million civilians, and he had made it deliberately, as a strategic calculation. But he was not a coward, and he was not stupid, and he was not willing to use his own people's lives as a bargaining chip to buy himself a few extra hours. He dismissed the second option without discussion. The third option he dismissed almost as fast. It would accomplish nothing. He asked his communications officer to open a direct channel to the Resolute Dawn. Personal frequency. Commander to commander. Cole Hargrove was in his quarters reviewing approach data when the request came through. He sat for a moment and then accepted the channel. The face of Vorexon appeared on the screen. He was older than Cole had expected, his features deeply lined, his eyes showing something that Cole recognized because he had seen it in mirrors over the past 6 months. The look of a person carrying a weight they cannot put down. Vorexon spoke without preamble. He said that he had ordered the attack on Aurelia Station. He said that he had believed it would serve as a deterrent, a demonstration of Veth military capability that would slow human expansion into zones the Dominion considered its own. He said that he had calculated the human response in terms of economics and political pressure, and that he had been wrong in every calculation he had made. He said that he accepted full personal responsibility for every name on the casualty manifest of Aurelia Station. He did not ask for mercy. He asked only one thing, that the civilians of Veth Prime and the other Veth worlds be spared. He said it plainly. His voice did not shake. Cole listened to all of it without speaking. When Vorexon was done, Cole sat quietly for a moment. Then he said what he had decided to say before he ever accepted the channel. He said that the civilians of Veth Prime had never been the target. That they had never been the target on any day since the fleet left the assembly point. That civilian populations did not bomb Aurelia Station. Military commanders gave that order, and that was where the account would be settled. He told Vorexon to broadcast to his people before the fleet arrived. He told him to tell the citizens of Veth Prime to stay in their homes, to not take up arms, and that no one who was not a combatant would be harmed. He said it as a statement of fact, not a promise made under pressure. Then he closed the channel. Darius Owens was part of the ground insertion team that went into the Veth orbital command platform above the capital world. They went in fast and quiet, and the Veth soldiers on the station had mostly laid down their weapons before the human teams reached them. There was scattered resistance in 2 corridors, brief and quickly ended. The platform was secured in under an hour. Darius moved through the station with his squad, clearing rooms and marking positions for the teams behind them. Near the center of the platform he found the operations room. He knew it immediately from the configuration of the consoles and the maps still displayed on the screens. This was where it had been planned. This was where the order had been given that had brought the Veth strike fleet to Aurelia Station on an ordinary Tuesday morning 6 months ago. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the screens for a long time. His squad stood quietly behind him, waiting. Nobody spoke. After a while Darius took out his camera and started documenting everything in the room. Every screen, every console, every piece of data storage he could find. He labeled and tagged it all with care. When one of his soldiers asked what they should do with it, Darius said the same word twice. Evidence. Then he sealed the room and moved on. The Resolute Dawn entered orbit above Veth Prime as the sun of the Veth system was rising over the capital city. The planet's surface was bright below, covered in the lights and structures of a civilization that had existed for centuries. It looked, from orbit, not entirely unlike Earth. Cole Hargrove opened a system-wide broadcast using the translation that Priya Sutton had prepared for him weeks earlier. He spoke to the entire population of the Veth Dominion in their own language, and he told them the truth. He told them that the fleet was not there to destroy their world. He told them that the people who ordered the killing of Aurelia Station's civilians would face a tribunal. He told them that the Veth Dominion would continue to exist, that their cities would not be burned, that their families would not be made to pay for what their government had done. He told them that all he asked was that they be still, and that justice be allowed to work. At the very end of the broadcast he added one sentence that had not been in the prepared text. He said, "We are not what you feared. But you should fear becoming what made this necessary." Then he closed the channel and sat down, and for the first time in 6 months, his hands were finally still. Part 5. They destroyed a human colony. Then 700,000 Earth warships arrived for total retribution. The tribunal took 11 months. It was held on a neutral station in the space between human and Veth territory, staffed by representatives from both civilizations and from 3 neutral alien powers who had agreed to provide oversight. High Marshal Vorexon and 12 of his senior command staff were brought there under guard, housed in clean and adequate conditions, and given full access to legal representation. The proceedings were broadcast live to every inhabited world that asked to receive them, and many did. Vorexon entered a full confession on the 3rd day of the trial. He described his decision-making process in detail, without excuses. He named every officer who had been involved in planning the strike. He described the meetings, the target selection process, the moment when the final order was given. He answered every question put to him. He did not attempt to distribute blame or to minimize what had been done. He sat upright in his seat and said what had happened with the same directness he had shown when he contacted Cole Hargrove from Veth Prime. The first witness called by the tribunal was Dr. Priya Sutton. She walked to the witness platform in a room full of representatives from multiple species and sat down and folded her hands on the table in front of her. She described the morning of the attack. She described the plant survey she had been conducting in the outer biodome. She described the sound of the first explosion, and how she had tried to explain it to herself as something ordinary. She described running for the bunker, the sound of the bombardment growing louder behind her, the moment when she reached the bunker door and pulled it open and threw herself inside. Then she described something small. She had been holding a cup of coffee when the first impact hit, she said. The vibration knocked it from her hand. She heard it hit the ground and break, and then she was running and she never went back for it. They found no trace of it in the wreckage afterward, she said. She did not know why she thought about that particular thing as often as she did. The room was completely silent. After the tribunal, the conversation on Earth was not simple. A large portion of the population had supported the deployment of the fleet and felt that justice had been done. But a significant portion of people also asked difficult questions. 700,000 warships. Was that proportional? The Veth Dominion had surrendered without a single one of its civilian cities being damaged. Its government had been dismantled, its military destroyed, its leadership handed to a tribunal. But no Veth civilian had been harmed. No Veth city had burned. In the end, the weight of the response had been directed entirely at those responsible and at the structures that enabled them. Some people called it restrained. Others called the fleet itself a form of threat so massive that it constituted its own kind of violence, regardless of whether the weapons were fired. Director Elaine Voss gave a formal address to the Earth Council 8 months after the end of the campaign. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not apologize. She said that humanity had assembled that fleet not because they wanted to destroy the Veth Dominion, but because they wanted the entire galaxy to understand what the cost of attacking a human colony would be. She said that if that understanding saved even one colony in the future, then every ship built and every crew deployed had been worth it. She said that there was no version of measured grief that would have communicated what needed to be communicated. Only the full weight of what humanity was willing to do had been able to do that. The address was recorded and replayed more than any other human speech in the decades that followed. People disagreed about it endlessly. But no one forgot it. Commander Cole Hargrove turned down the promotion to Fleet Admiral. He submitted the refusal in a short written note that gave no explanation beyond the statement that he believed his time was better spent elsewhere. He requested reassignment to the Aurelia Station reconstruction project, and the request was granted. He arrived on the partially rebuilt colony 6 weeks after the end of the tribunal and began the work of supervising the construction of the new residential domes. He stayed for 3 years. He was not the most senior person on the project, and he did not try to be. He did logistics work, attended planning meetings, helped resolve disputes between construction teams. He ate in the common hall with the workers and slept in the same modular housing units as everyone else. People knew who he was, but he did not trade on it, and after a while it became unremarkable that he was simply there, doing the work. On the day the first new residential dome was sealed, pressurized, and confirmed habitable, Cole was present. People who had been born in evacuation camps and had never known anything other than temporary shelters walked into the dome and stood on the ground inside it. Some of them stood very still for a moment, adjusting to the feeling of being somewhere permanent. Some of the children ran immediately, the way children run when they are given space. That evening Cole recorded a short personal log entry. He described what he had seen. He described it simply, without decoration. Then at the end he said his sister's name. Just her name, Mara, and nothing after it. Then he closed the log. Nora Callahan left active service 2 years after the campaign ended. She spent the following year writing a full account of the mobilization, drawing on her personal logs and the tactical records she had been authorized to access. The document was classified when she submitted it. It was declassified 7 years later and published, and it became one of the primary reference texts for the period. Decades later, a journalist interviewing her asked what it had felt like to watch the fleet assemble from the observation window of the Resolute Dawn. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It felt like watching an entire species decide, all at once, that it was done being patient." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Darius Owens went home to Detroit after his service ended. His neighborhood had a memorial park near the center, one of thousands built across human space in the years after Aurelia. His had a long black stone wall with names on it, the names of people from his neighborhood who had been living on the colony when the attack happened. He visited it sometimes. He did not visit it on schedule or on specific dates, just when he happened to be walking that way. A journalist found him there once and asked what he wanted people to remember. Darius thought about it for a moment, looking at the wall. Then he said that it did not have to happen. And that once it did, we made sure it would be the last time. The journalist asked if he thought it would really be the last time. Darius looked at the wall a little longer. Then he said, "Ask the Veth." Envoy Thessan spent the rest of his working life on the Interstellar Accountability Council, the joint body established after the conflict to create and enforce rules of engagement for all spacefaring civilizations. He helped write the founding charter. The process took 4 years and required compromise from every party involved. The first article of the charter, which every member civilization signed, read, "No civilian population shall be used as a target, a message, or a bargaining position in any military action." Thessan kept a copy of that article framed on the wall of his office until the end of his life. It was the only decoration in the room. Priya Sutton returned to Aurelia Station 2 years after the reconstruction began. She went back to her botanical survey, the same one she had been conducting on the morning of the attack. She worked her way slowly through the outer biodome, checking on the new growth, cataloging the hybrid crops that the new team of scientists had been developing. It felt ordinary in the way that things feel ordinary when you have survived something that should have made ordinary impossible. She was grateful for it. One afternoon she found something unexpected in the soil near the far wall of the outer dome. A root system from one of the original hybrid plants she had been cataloging before the attack. It had survived somehow, deep in the ground, through everything. It had put out new growth in the months since the dome had been rebuilt and the soil had been treated and watered again. It was not large. It was just alive. She sat down on the ground next to it and stayed there for a long time. She wrote its data into her catalog. She gave it a proper scientific name in the record. And then she put down her tablet and sat with her hands in the dirt of a rebuilt world, and she let herself cry. Not just for Aurelia. For all of it. For everything that had been lost and everything that had, against every reasonable expectation, managed to keep growing. The fleet was gone. All 700,000 ships had returned to their home ports and their peacetime duties. The shipyards were building cargo vessels again. The people who had crewed those ships had gone back to their lives, carrying what they carried. But everyone in the galaxy knew now. Everyone knew what it looked like when humanity came for you. Everyone knew the number. 700,000. They knew what it meant when those ships moved, and they knew that the people inside them had read every name before they left. The galaxy had not become a safe place overnight. It never does. But it had become a place where certain calculations had changed permanently. Where certain decisions that might once have seemed worth making were no longer worth making, because the people on the other side of those decisions had shown, clearly and completely, exactly what they were willing to do. And on a small rebuilt colony in the Kepler 62 system, in a biodome full of new growth and old roots, a scientist sat in the warm soil and breathed the air of a world her species had refused to give up. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.